Have you ever found yourself completely absorbed in one of those really high-budget wildlife documentaries?
Oh, absolutely.
Or maybe you're reading through a fascinating new environmental study, and you actually pause to picture the scientists behind the work.
Right, you try to imagine the people actually out there doing it.
Yeah. Usually the image that jumps to mind is someone trekking through a dense, rain-soaked forest.
Checking camera traps at dawn.
Exactly. Checking traps. Or maybe managing this massive team of volunteers, or taking those breathtaking up-close photographs of apex predators in the wild.
It's a very specific mental image we all have.
It is. But there is this really compelling concept that's surfaced in today's stack of research, and it's something scientists are actively calling the ghost effect.
The ghost effect. Yes.
According to the data we're looking at today, women are absolutely everywhere in this field. They're out there doing exactly those things.
It's heavy lifting.
Right, checking the traps, validating the environmental data, running the grueling field work. Yet somehow, they often become ghosts when it comes to the official leadership titles.
And the final publications.
Exactly, and the broader public recognition.
It's a really striking contrast. You have this massive divergence between the demographic doing the foundational, highly demanding work on the ground and the demographic that is ultimately recognized, both academically and culturally, as the face of that research.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive today into a comprehensive stack of detailed studies and raw data, looking specifically at the gender gap in ecology, environmental science, and wildlife research.
That's a lot of data.
It is. We want to understand what the landscape actually looks like for women working in these disciplines right now, getting past the assumptions and looking straight at the hard numbers.
And just to set the parameters for how we're going to approach this, we are going strictly by the numbers. We're looking at the structural realities presented in the research. So we're going to look closely at authorship data, the mechanics of the peer review process, fieldwork demographics.
Especially that really granular data out of Europe.
Yes, excellent data there. And also the rapidly expanding world of citizen science.
Our goal here is to be completely objective. We want to explore exactly where this gap exists in the data, and crucially, why the researchers conducting these studies say it's happening.
Exactly. We aren't here to take ideological sides or, push a specific perspective.
No, not at all.
We are simply impartial guides walking you through what the source material reveals about the mechanics of the scientific community.
That's a crucial distinction. We aren't guessing at motives. We're tracking the paper trail.
Precisely.
Speaking of which, let's start with where that trail usually ends for any working scientist, which is publication.
The ultimate goal.
Right. The raw data for overall ecology and environmental science journals gives us a really clear baseline to start with. Across the board, when you look at all authors on these papers, women make up about 30 to 31%.
Okay.
Meanwhile, men make up about 69 to 70%.
What's fascinating here is how that baseline completely shifts when you look at the hierarchy of authorship.
What do you mean by hierarchy?
Well, in academic publishing, the order of the names on a paper isn't just a polite alphabetical list.
Right, it's not random.
No, it tells a very specific story about power, funding, and career stage. The data shows that women actually make up about 40% of first authors.
Oh, wow. That's higher than the overall average.
It is. And the first author is typically the person who did the bulk of the day-to-day research, very often an early career scientist.
Like a PhD student or a postdoc.
Exactly. The person who spent months running the actual experiments.
Right, so there is a very strong showing at the entry level, which makes sense given the demographics of graduate programs.
Yeah. But then you flip to the other end of the author list, and the picture changes entirely.
The last author.
Precisely. When we look at the senior or last author position, the representation of women drops to less than 25%.
Less than a quarter.
Specifically, the studies put it at about 23 to 25%, meaning men occupy 75 to 77% of those roles.
That's a huge drop.
It is. And when you look at the wider landscape, the senior author isn't just a name at the end of a list. They are usually the laboratory leader.
The principal investigator.
Right. They're the ones who conceptualize the broader multi-year project, secure the massive institutional funding, and ultimately direct the lab's legacy.
Which means that a lack of female senior authors has a massive cascading effect on the overall publication output of the entire discipline.
Absolutely.
Because those senior authors are the gatekeepers of their own labs, right? They essentially build the teams.
They hire everyone else.
Yeah, and the sources actually point out something really revealing here. Research groups that are led by male principal investigators often have far fewer female co-authors than labs led by women.
It's a stark difference.
So who happens to be sitting at the top directly impacts who gets an opportunity to put their name on the paper down the line.
It creates a structural bottleneck. And naturally, when people hear that women are publishing less overall or holding roughly 1 in 4 senior authorship roles,
Yeah.
a very common assumption jumps to mind regarding how these papers are actually judged.
Wait, my immediate thought here, and I'm sure anyone listening who has ever anxiously waited for a journal's decision is thinking the exact same thing.
Is it the reviewers?
Right. The journals themselves must be rejecting these papers. Is there a bias at the editorial desk? Are peer reviewers looking at female-led papers and turning them down at a higher rate?
It seems like the most logical explanation for the gap.
It really does. But here's where it gets really interesting. The studies show little to no evidence of systemic editorial discrimination.
None at all.
The bias myth in peer review is, according to the research we're looking at, genuinely just a myth.
That is fascinating.
The sources provide a highly detailed case study on this from the journal Functional Ecology. They didn't just look at the final published papers.
They looked at the whole process.
Right. They tracked the entire submission pipeline to see exactly how manuscripts were treated based on the gender of the authors from the exact moment they hit the editor's inbox.
And what were the findings? Because that is incredibly clear data to work with.
Frankly, quite definitive. Papers with female authors were equally likely to be sent out for peer review in the first place.
So no desk rejection bias?
None. And once they were in the hands of the reviewers, they received similar reviewer scores to papers written by men.
Okay.
And the ultimate kicker, they had the exact same probability of acceptance as papers from men. There was zero statistical difference.
Wow. So it's not the final hurdle.
Yeah.
Getting the paper accepted isn't the problem. The gatekeepers at the journals aren't tossing out papers just because women wrote them, which is a crucial insight for us. If the journals aren't actively rejecting women's papers at a higher rate, then the gender gap in publishing isn't coming from a biased peer review process.
So where is it coming from?
Well, the researchers identify the real culprits as structural issues within the career path itself. We're looking at career interruptions, widespread retention issues, and the historical inertia of male-dominated research groups.
So they just aren't getting to that stage as often.
Exactly. There are simply fewer women advancing to those senior academic positions to lead large labs or large projects to begin with.
It's the obstacle course getting to the starting line of senior leadership that filters people out.
That's a great way to put it.
And that brings us to a concept that researchers refer to as the leaky pipeline. Let's track this chronological drop-off together because the numbers paint a really vivid picture of how this works over the lifespan of a scientific career.
The pipeline actually starts incredibly strong. At the student and PhD level in ecology and environmental science, women make up roughly 50% of the field.
Oh, so it's half and half.
It is essentially at parity when people are first entering the discipline, full of energy and ready to do the groundwork.
But then the leaks begin.
Right.
From that 50% at the student level, it drops to about 40% when we look at who is actually publishing those first author papers we talked about earlier.
The early career researchers.
Yeah. Then, as careers progress into the associate and full professor stages, it drops again to just 25% for senior authors and lab leaders.
It just keeps dropping.
And finally, when we look at the very top of the academic gatekeeping structure, the editors of the journals themselves, women make up only about 20 to 30%.
This raises an important question about editorial power. Editors shape the entire direction of the field.
They decide what gets published.
Right. They decide what topics are prioritized, what special issues are put together, and what research is deemed significant enough to warrant attention.
It's a lot of influence.
Across environmental and land science journals, women represent about 20 to 25% of editorial board members. In fact, in many of these journals, the studies note that less than 1/3 of the board members are women.
Wow.
And when you look at the absolute top role, the editors-in-chief,
Let me guess.
only about 20% are women, the remaining 80% are men.
It is a very steep pyramid, but it is worth noting that the sources do point out a positive trend here. This isn't an entirely static situation.
No, things are changing.
In one specific ecology journal dataset they tracked, the proportion of female editors jumped from almost 0 to 29% by the year 2015.
That's a significant jump.
So the needle is slowly moving in the right direction as awareness grows.
And there are also specific subfields that serve as notable exceptions to the broader rule.
Really? Like what?
The data shows that conservation biology journals, titles like Conservation Biology, Biological Conservation, and Ecological Applications, they actually have much better gender representation than the average ecology field.
What's driving that difference? Is there something fundamentally different about how conservation biology operates compared to general ecology?
The researchers suggest it's because conservation biology, as a discipline, tends to attract more women at all career stages from the very beginning.
Oh, I see.
The baseline pipeline is simply more robust. Because the field retains more women from the undergraduate level upward, that naturally translates to better representation on editorial boards.
And in senior authorship roles within that specific niche.
Right. It proves that when the pipeline doesn't leak as severely early on, the leadership demographics naturally follow suit.
That actually perfectly sets up how different geographic regions handle these same challenges, because our sources also include some fantastic, detailed demographics mapping the situation across Europe.
Yes, the European data is very revealing.
It is. And Europe is a brilliant case study because it largely mirrors these global patterns, but with some very distinct regional flavors based on local policies.
Exactly. When we look at the European research workforce in these environmental fields, women make up about 45 to 55% of graduate programs.
So similar to the global average.
But geographics matter immensely here. Northern European countries, specifically places like Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands, report slightly higher proportions of women at this early stage compared to the continental average.
But just like the global leaky pipeline, once you hit the postdoctoral level in Europe, the representation drops to about 35 to 40%.
The same leak.
Yeah. The sources specifically highlight that career interruptions, often related to family responsibilities or the intense pressure to relocate globally for temporary postdoc positions, disproportionately affect women at this critical juncture.
And when you advance to the senior academic roles, associate professors, full professors, principal investigators, the geographical divide becomes even more pronounced.
How so?
Overall in Europe, women hold about 20 to 30% of these senior roles. However, in Southern and Eastern Europe, that number dips lower, closer to 15 to 25%.
Okay, so a regional drop.
Conversely, countries that have instituted highly proactive gender equality policies, places like Sweden, Norway, and the UK, they tend to have significantly more female leaders in both academia and NGO-led conservation initiatives.
It shows that policy actually does impact the pipeline. It's not just an inevitable force of nature.
Exactly.
Take Horizon Europe, for example, which is the EU's flagship funding program, passing out billions in research grants.
Massive funding.
Even at that scale, with a growing awareness of gender balance, the data tells us that women still lead only about 30% of the high-profile environmental and conservation projects. The really large multinational collaborative networks remain heavily male-dominated.
Though it's important to note that programs specifically designed to encourage female leadership within those massive European grants are beginning to help narrow that gap. Mentorship networks and female-focused startup grants are actively helping to retain women in these senior positions. And as we established earlier, retaining women in PI roles directly influences the publication rates and overall visibility of other women coming up through their labs.
Visibility is the perfect word to bring us to the next layer of this data. Let's take this out of the academic journals and the university funding boards and put our boots back on the ground.
Into the field.
Let's talk about fieldwork and citizen science, because the contrast here is absolutely stark. Anyone who has spent 3 weeks in a muddy tent sorting water samples knows how grueling fieldwork is.
It's exhausting.
But the data shows women are absolutely out there doing it.
It really is the backbone of ecology and wildlife research. You cannot publish a paper without the raw data.
Nope.
And in early career and university-led surveys, women are highly visible. They make up 40 to 50% of field crews, trudging through those muddy tents and operating the field equipment.
And when you look at citizen science, which includes things like urban ecology initiatives, community bird counts, or large-scale biodiversity logging, women are actually often the majority.
The majority.
Yeah. The sources show them making up 55 to 60% of participants. They are heavily engaged in the meticulous long-term data validation that these massive projects completely rely on to function.
But again, we see a structural drop-off the moment the nature of the work shifts toward prestige or extreme specialization.
Meaning what, exactly?
As fieldwork projects become more physically isolated, think remote Arctic outposts or deep-sea expeditions, the representation of women drops to between 25 and 35%.
Why is that?
The research indicates this is influenced by historical biases, deeply established network effects, where male researchers tend to invite other male researchers on these expeditions,
The old boys club.
essentially, and lingering cultural perceptions about suitability for certain types of rugged fieldwork.
And the drop-off isn't just about the location. It happens when it's time to put a name on the clipboard. For multi-site field programs, or those massive national citizen science initiatives, the senior coordinators and project leaders are still 65 to 75% men.
So where are the women leading?
The data shows they're much more likely to be leading smaller local initiatives, educational outreach programs, or community NGO-led projects.
Which means women are generating an immense amount of the raw knowledge. They are highly visible in data collection, logging the hours, and maintaining the community networks.
Right.
But their underrepresentation in the senior decision-making roles inherently limits their broader career progression and their official, citable recognition in the scientific record.
So what does this all mean? We've looked at authorship hierarchies, we've busted the peer review bias myth, we traced the leaky pipeline, examined the European policy data, and looked at the muddy boots of fieldwork demographics.
It's a lot of pieces.
It all loops perfectly back to that opening hook we talked about, the ghost effect. Picture it again. Women are out there doing the heavy lifting, literally half the crew standing in the field collecting the data, but they slowly disappear from the official narrative of the research as it moves up the chain.
The mechanics of this invisibility are complex, but the sources break them down into three distinct components that operate simultaneously.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, there is the disconnect between field presence and leadership visibility. As you pointed out, women might make up half the crew doing the labor, but it is the male project leader's name that goes on the final publication as the principal investigator.
Right, which leads directly to the second component, authorship and visibility.
Yes.
Because the academic system rigidly dictates that senior and first authorship are what determine recognition, grant success, and career advancement, all of those hands-on contributions by the rest of the team go largely uncredited in the wider scientific discourse.
They did the work, but they don't get the academic currency for it. And thirdly, we have to consider media and institutional memory, which shapes how the public understands science.
Oh, this is the big one.
When wildlife documentaries are filmed, or official press releases are published, or even just social media campaigns are launched by universities, they frequently feature male scientists as the face of the research.
Always the face.
Institutional reports tend to highlight their predominantly male directors or principal investigators when showcasing a major breakthrough.
Even when the volunteer programs or the massive citizen science networks that generated the breakthrough were actually coordinated by women on the ground.
Exactly.
It creates a feedback loop of who we picture when we hear the word scientist.
So the core takeaway here, and this is vital to understand based on the extensive research we've reviewed, is that this ghost effect is absolutely not about an absence of effort.
Or a lack of expertise.
Right, or a lack of presence by women in these fields.
They are out there.
They are very much there, at parity in many stages. The ghost effect is a symptom of a structural and cultural visibility issue. The current system simply rarely gives them the spotlight or the formal citable credit that translates into leadership and historical recognition.
It is a profound realization. To summarize this deep dive for you, we've learned that the environmental sciences, ecology, and wildlife research actually don't suffer from a systemic, biased rejection of women's work during the peer review process.
The journals are treating the science fairly once it reaches their desks.
Instead, it is a complex web of structural hurdles, career interruptions, and that persistent leaky pipeline that keeps the highest levels of leadership, senior authorship, and project management predominantly male.
Even as women enter the field in equal numbers and drive much of the vital hands-on data collection. And that reality leaves us with a rather profound implication for the future of the science itself. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it leads to a question that isn't explicitly answered by the numbers, but naturally arises from them.
What's the question?
If the people doing the hands-on data collection, the people intimately interacting with our forests, our oceans, and our urban environments on a daily basis, if they are fundamentally different from the people who sit at the desks, writing the final narratives, securing the funding, and setting the academic agendas,
Wow, right.
how might that unseen, ghosted perspective be subtly altering the very scientific questions we choose to ask?
That is a brilliant point.
And consequently, how might it be limiting the solutions we find for the future of wildlife conservation?
That is a challenging thought to leave you with. How does the invisibility of the data collectors shape the science we rely on? It's something to really mull over the next time you're out in nature or reading up on the latest conservation efforts.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the data. We love unpacking these complex realities with you, and we appreciate your curiosity. Until next time, keep asking questions.